Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are working on the offense of our players that are still working their way up through the ranks. It becomes very important, as we mentioned last week, and was demonstrated so well last week by the player that joined us. But offense is a complex subject and usually very tricky, so in order to make it more like that and not just have a character that will completely dominate the space or pressure, Jasvine is joining the team today to play Jury, mostly at least. Might see Cody later on, but probably not. Because Jury is a character capable of doing this job quite well. She can defend in lots of ways, but has just enough little bits of things you can cause her to mess up, little spaces you can get into that will make things difficult for her. And of course, Jasvine needs some training with those things as well. So presuming that Street Fighter manages to connect our two players to start with, we will get started on that. You can, as always, feel free to join us. We don't expect to have a very full lounge right away, as you can see already. It will probably pick up later on into the stream, so sorry if you at that point don't find that there's a slot open for you. Search for Rune Siren with 3 rounds first to 2. Character select is off today. You know, to at least give Jasvine some time to figure out what will be happening, what to expect.
Fight.
Check some notes, switch some mindsets, what's required. But this character has a lot of good defensive tools when you're willing to use them and not too timid about it. Now, unfortunately, by most standards, she's still not a very strong character, and part of the reason for this is because she takes more risks in her defense than a lot of the other footsie or defensive characters do. Meaning that you have to have better execution to confirm off of all the little stray hits she gets during the footsies phase. She's good at getting stray hits, but it requires a lot of the player to be ready to deal with it. If you drop your combos, bad things happen. But we're also going to be looking at that as a part of Street Fighter for today. How to think about it when you find yourself dropping combos, but that's basically the only reason you're losing the match. Because that absolutely does happen. And it is particularly a thing that happens to very good defensive players, since they don't usually spend as much time grinding combos, or even if they do, everyone drops combos sometime. But having really good defense means that often that's the timing you see as the time you take damage in a match. Deciding, have I made a wrong decision, can itself be stressful, but most of the time, the answer for the defensive player who is on top of their game is no. They don't tend to make many mistakes, and they don't tend to make many incorrect decisions. Their problem is almost always more so that they drop a combo, that they drop some execution somewhere, that their stress is increased by that. One thing you can do for yourself, however, is to consider that a lot of the time, you don't really take any real damage outside of footsies, and sometimes not even in footsies, if you play defensively enough. Oh, what is up with this thing today? Is it gonna cut off again? I wonder if the stream itself is affected. I hope not. Hopefully this will be mostly just between these two players. But interesting thing is that, of course, that the match itself, at least from this side, was perfectly smooth. So it looks like there might just be overall connectivity issues. And we are really full now, suddenly. As well as a relatively large dip in... I guess that was probably a glitch. Let's hope they don't continue, given that she is the mainstay point of today's play. But we'll see, because we also have a Cody who can easily take over the job if they manage to beat her. Cody is a character that plays defense relatively well, can play offense in a specific way that is also suitable for this. But if you choose to mostly play offense, then he tends to lose a lot of his defensive capacity. But we'll see whether this works out and whether or not just fine. We'll need to switch to offense in order to get something herself here. Because I do see Crime Sway and Dirty Coach as the choices on the V system for this player, meaning you're definitely looking at what should be a more defensive Cody, but maybe they're balancing out their offensive nature with the defensive part of the V system. So let's watch more or less without my commentary for a bit. As this matchup, while I understand it, is really complicated, and I didn't want to start off the stream with complicated things. One uncomplicated thing to keep in mind, and that really won't be all that easy to deal with from Just Fine's side regardless, is that Cody has a really long, what we call zoning jump. Super good at getting really, really far jumps, making it hard to be sure how to deal with it, as you can't necessarily anti-air immediately. You can't be sure that Cody will actually even hit the button, and therefore he might drop in on you. And you can't really air throw or similar. Jury, on the other hand, is one of the few characters that can absolutely anti-air this. It's just that she has to change her mindset about how to do it compared to most characters. What she will probably have to worry about is the second jump. If one fails the anti-air on the first, it's often a good idea to just jump again. Particularly if your character has both a good long zoning jump and a good cross-up button. But it looks like mostly this flow is working as expected. And the thing that's going to be hard here is, once again, making sure to actually anti-air that jump. This is one of the few jumps in the game that Jury can anti-air with her own jumping kicks, but the timing at which Cody hits the kick determines whether or not you're going to be successful at that. So it's also not guaranteed, meaning it's one of those things where you have to be ready for multiple different options on the jump.
Round one.
This is probably the hardest part of defense to a player who's used to reacting in close range, blocking, spacing themselves correctly. Figuring out how to make sure that you don't get tricked by the opponent's jumps is high on the list of things you often need to practice. Particularly for characters like Cody, who really do have quite a lot of options. Jury can definitely do some things with her own uppercut, let's call it, but this is a different type of response and has a different timing than any of her other anti-airs as well, making it even harder.
And that's how I handle things. You want another? Round two. Fight. Bingo.
One good option actually is to walk more toward Cody a lot of the time. He's a character with a lot of good ways to mess with you for doing it, to force you to block, but as a confident-ish defensive player, walking forward is not really that terrible a plan, moving you into a position where it's a little bit easier to know which anti-air to use in time. This will often, of course, stop the opponent from jumping as much, but depending on how good your mid-range footsies and defense are, you might not care at all. Yuri also has a lot of good moves to just move her forward a little bit during all of the rest of that, so you get to see that sort of thing play out as well. In fact, this is definitely one of the situations where giving your opponent any quarter at all tends to lead to bad things. And that looked like a moment of glitchy lag again, so that definitely didn't help.
Cody wins.
But on the upside, our Cody player is defensive enough that I think we'll get something out of it as well.
Let's do this.
The Wolf is likely to face a similar problem in this matchup. Not because Alex has much trouble anti-airing Cody, he's one of the few characters who can consistently do that. Just almost every time. If you decide to try to use Cody's long zoning jump, and the Alex player is capable of using either their heavy punch anti-air when you try to do certain things, or air knee smash at basically any range, that's more so a timing thing than a spacing thing. If you can manage the air knee smash against the jumps, then you are pretty much set. Cody really can't jump at you. Not without making sure that he's completely faking it. So if you see a really far jump, maybe you don't want to finish, but if you see a reasonably close jump, just air knee smash and you're done. As you can see, therefore, one of Cody's better options is to play defensively enough to force Alex to walk forward or come forward and spend mental time and space on doing offense. So, that's what we got today, that's what we were aiming for.
Round 2. Fight.
That said, do remember from our last stream that offense is not always about that defense is not always about doing nothing or blocking a lot or standing in a very specific space away from the opponent. Technically that can be a form of offense, just as doing moves to fill space in front of you that your opponent might be advantaged by moving into fills a defense requirement. These buttons that McBucket is hitting are not necessarily the really great options for Cody neutral. They lead to very little unless the opponent has specifically set their mind on trying a thing. If you've decided, I'm going to block, I'm going to backdash, I'm going to neutral jump, a lot of these Cody options are no longer really good options.
Round 1.
And he's not a character who recovers from most of his moves fast enough to then poke you out of the air, or chase down backdashes, or those sorts of things. He also doesn't have any really terrifying moves from most spacings. And Alex in particular can easily counter a lot of Cody's stuff if the Cody player doesn't backdash out of their own space a lot. But if you convince your opponent that they must play offense, you get to take up a lot of that space yourself without taking a whole lot of damage necessarily. This has similar requirements to the jury thing mentioned before. You have to be ready with Cody to confirm a lot of things, to get into the correct spaces, to watch your opponent's rhythm and tendencies.
That's how I handle. Round 2. Fight. Tornado.
Part of how this is done, in fact, is entirely just doing moves without the expectation that they will hit. Sometimes you just do moves in case your opponent wants to do something, and if they happen to hit, then you continue. Cody is a stronger character for this than most because the animations of Cody's moves are so long that you get large amounts of confirmation time. This is not something that is very easily thought about a lot of the time. Many characters don't quite know if their move is going to connect or not until fairly late into it. The move is long, or the opponent might move a little bit, or you're just not sure that the hitboxes will land in the way you want it to because your opponent might use a forward hopping move or a low. But Cody's moves hit all this very nice level, solid mid-height attack style, meaning that most of the time you can be pretty assured that you're going to land your hit.
Let's do this. Desk work just isn't my thing, you know? Round one. Fight!
Seth offense is often difficult. It's something that comes up a lot in our various lounges with the president working on this character. Seth offense is a little binary and doesn't have a lot of, hey, let me fake you out options in it. You can walk around a lot and hope that your opponent uses the wrong move too. Basically, it has to do with hoping the opponent flinches, but most of Seth's moves are slow enough that even if you couldn't react to them by hitting Seth out of them, you could definitely block. And because most of those moves then don't lead to pressury situations on block, from there,
Round two. Fight!
Cody is therefore actually better served by using a lot of Zonk Knuckle, mainly because it deals with a lot of flows. But Prime Sway does also a good job on top of all that, and we hadn't seen it used before, so maybe it will come up more here. But again, this has more to do with the opposite situation happening. We see a particular strength of Seth's offense here that is really important to other types of play and other types of characters as well. Knowing that one has enough of an advantage to just walk forward. This is something that has been important in the training of multiple team members recently. The understanding and flow related to just walking forward and merely nothing else, simply because the character is in some way able to counter most, if not all, of the things that anyone would want to do. Sometimes it's a rough test of your own reactions, especially if your opponent does something really gutsy in order to achieve the goal, but it's not terribly difficult. The difficulty has to do with more so that moment where you choose to wiggle backward, especially if your character has a really obvious tell when they've decided to walk backward. Seth unfortunately has an extremely strong tell for this. Fortunately, it doesn't tend to lead to much because it's too easy to anti-air. Meaning, since Seth is fighting from outside most characters' dash ranges anyway, you can't dash up, you can't just anti-air, and you can't just do random moves either. You can't throw projectiles on the walk back. There's a lot of good things that Seth gets out of being able to walk back without being in danger, but it does require a lot of focus, and it does require that the opponent not use one specific tactic, namely dash blocking. Dash blocking is an extremely powerful option against Seth because it forces the opponent to think about how to get themselves to B+, along with everything else. And since most of Seth's good counters to dash blocking are not great moves in themselves, that right there is approximately your best option. Seth does have one weakness when it comes to that sort of defense. The ranges of Mad Cradle are specific. More so than nearly every other uppercut character in the game now. Meaning you can often jump over and past Mad Cradle enough to get something out of it. And with fewer good anti-air buttons, there's always going to be that point where it's required. Seth's backflipping kick also isn't so great against cross-ups unless done early. Meaning there's definitely a way to get this done, but you have to think more so about how to get into the position to go for the cross-up while Seth is focused on something else.
Cody wins. Round one. Fight!
Of course, this also adds one more level of offense. When the opponent looks for the cross-up, it means that sometimes they don't have to cross-up. Again, so much of this is about straining the opponent, making them think, okay, well, what am I required to do here? But if you increase the concept of requirements, then you've probably managed to do well for yourself.
Round two.
In short, therefore, our Cody player can do better by jumping for the cross-up about half the time and jumping for the normal jump about half the time, just without trying for specifically the long-range jump. And as you can see, the Crime Spray also helps here because it is a way to move forward alongside Zonk that has an option to be confusing. The style of play also plays in fairly well with not needing the invincible wake-up style V-skill. But That mad cradle worked. That was kind of late, because there were obviously other times to use that, and I wonder if it was a little after imaging, but either way, it has worked out today for the Cody player, although coming very close.
It's go time.
Which brings us around to Kazuki Dynasty's attempt against this same style of play. And this is probably going to be a little rough because of the same problem. Karine does not deal well with Cody's jump arc, does not deal well with Cody's long range jump. Even Tenko doesn't work super well. In fact, one of your better options is just to seppo under it entirely and counterattack from the other side. Cody stays in the air just long enough that this can lead to combos, but which seppo, which combo, and which confirm? Because if you drop any of them, you're dealing with a very strong character at close range. But there's just no way around it. As long as you are not in the position where you are getting to play footsies because you've set up the offense the way you want, you have to deal with this jump. And knowing that you have to deal with the jump makes it harder to do the rest of the match anyway. But it is one of those situations where it's not so bad because it's not actually a level of additional stress. He jumps from so far, and the failures of Karine's anti-air capacity against him are so obvious that it's relatively easier to switch the mind state. Either you're probably going to block, be too slow on the seppo, or seppo correctly. You don't have to worry about all the in-betweens of, should I have hit a different anti-air button? There are a couple of times where the opponent can get to a spacing where it would be good for Karine to anti-air with something else, but they're really few on this character. Activating V trigger early also helps because of the fact that if Cody is trying to do long zoning jumps, there's no real option to easily punish a whiffed parry. At max range for that jump, basically you just parry early-ish, and if they don't happen to hit you, you're probably not going to die at least. You're not going to get any huge crush counter style damage off of most things Cody does from that range, and therefore it's probably worth getting your V trigger active early, especially since in this style of play the V reversal is unlikely to be the critical point. Karine has other options if she really thinks the opponent is going to go for more pressure, because Cody at least has enough clear vectors and sequences that you could probably uppercut out of them. He is not usually too far away, he's not usually too hard to understand. You either backdash or uppercut if you really are thinking that's going to be a thing that keeps happening. And if you think carefully about this matchup, Karine doesn't use her meter for anything else in this matchup. You don't really need to go through Tornado with EX anything.
Round one.
And EX Fujin isn't really a strong option, so it doesn't come up. But that doesn't mean that a player who has been training on anti-airs of other types is actually going to be able to stop themselves from automatically anti-airing. The important thing is to know that when you are comfortable enough, you can just realize, well, yeah, that was my muscle memory. I'm used to anti-airing at that space, so I did. It's fine. Instead of getting hung up on the fact that you can't get yourself to do the other thing. Some opponents will, of course, just abuse this, but that's not really terribly useful. It's on you, yes, but they are taking advantage of something that could easily be countered. You could just stop dropping it. You could just start doing it right. And if they're already better than you, then sure, it helps, because they get to win the match without having to push on their actual skill. You don't have to play at your full, you just do something your opponent can't stop until they get frustrated and lose. But this can cause you to underestimate opponents as a generality, and that can lead to some really, really annoying and sometimes humiliating losses. When the opponent does suddenly adapt, do the right thing a couple times, and you find yourself not knowing what to do. This is definitely similar to the long-lost, seldom mentioned dragon roll throw, because not only can Cody still hit, but he could technically do some good damage. The problem is that it's almost impossible to confirm which side of Kareem you've landed on to know how to do it. He doesn't have many command normals, so that helps the process, but it's still frustrating and confusing because not knowing which side of Kareem you have even hit is disorienting in itself.
Final round. Fight.
That said, all of this still comes down to an issue with offense. And learning to deal with this part is still hard for Kansuki Dynasty because it's again about being able and willing to just walk the opponent really far without ever thinking about trying to hit them. Once they're in the corner, you can do what you want, because if you practice your corner guard enough, as many of us have because we have a bot for it, your opponent really doesn't have a lot of options other than to go for something quick like that and hope it works. If it does work, good for them, but the overall situation didn't improve. And you can often keep your own flow calm enough simply by not deciding that you have to hit your opponent. But it appears that that decision was made, and therefore our Cody player continues to show us more defensive techniques.
Let's do this.
Desk work.
Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight. Final round. Fight.
McBucket continues to skillfully defend Metro City. But Cody is not so great with this particular matchup. You can already see, for example, that the V skill needed to be changed. Because without V skill 1 for at least some moments of invincibility, this gets really rough. You can definitely do it, but you have to spend a lot more time convincing the Alex player not to do certain things. And we didn't necessarily see a whole lot of that before. We didn't see a whole lot of successful convincing the opponent to not do X or Y. There was a lot more waiting for them to do the wrong thing, or filling space, and Alex is not a character against which either of those things works. Alex has more ability to fill space than you, where you is just the general you, doesn't really matter who you play, except maybe Abigail. And you also can't really decide, well, I'm just going to sit over here and assume he can't reach me, because he can. With specials, this is. Your strength, therefore, in this matchup is more so being able to retreat from Alex and then suddenly counterattack when he tries to advance into the space. Your method of retreat is up to you, but Cody only really has 2 good ones anyway, so there's that to consider. Mostly, you jump backwards or you dash backwards. Walking backwards is not the greatest plan because Alex will force you to block in some way and cause you stress, and throwing projectiles doesn't really help you.
Believe it or not, I'm pretty busy.
That is probably going to get blocked. Indeed. There's a little too much space between the 2 players for that to not get blocked.
Round 2. Fight.
So All Might showing us very effectively why it is that you can't just decide to defend indefinitely. Any character that can reach you and can get through the space you want to put normals into doesn't have to deal with them. You just end up feeling like you shouldn't do it. You see a lot of movement here along those lines, whereas before, Bucket was willing to hit a lot of buttons in neutral, or to move back and forth without thinking about that part of the game. Now it's less likely, less accepted.
Let's have some fun.
No lag there, but might be this side actually. This would have been a little odd on this side. Not ready on the throw. So as you can see, Alex has just a ton of options for this situation is now in my favor. What are you going to do about it? But
Final round.
once one does have a lot of the defenses baked in to certain things Alex does, you're probably going to have at least some success. How much success is a different question, and you do have to chew through that 1025 health. So you can't afford to be twitchy. This is one of those combos that, yeah, there you go. It's too dependent on range, too dependent on really strong focus and awareness. Definitely a good attempt, but that was going to be rough to land. That's the sort of thing you see from Platinum players or from Diamond players who have studied and been ready for that like 100 times. Which brings All Might to the victory position, meaning that we're probably going to take a break from talking about this specific thing for a bit because All Might is more of the actual namesake style, high octane, not necessarily in your face, but definitely not the type to specifically sit back there and play a ton of defense long enough for people to end up learning, well, this is how I deal with this. Can probably be done, but I'm not going to count on it. And it looks like our Cody is out for now, as well as a continual situation with Just Fine's connection. I guess it just decided not to want to stream today or something. So, while we're probably not changing the overall concept of the stream, our tweet advertised Just Vine moment is not as likely to happen, and you might get to see something or someone else trying to take up that space. But that brings us back to the Alex mirror, probably, because we do have characters let off today, and Dwarf is still learning from All Might's skills with this character. Now, most of these skills don't directly apply to the mirror match, but a lot of the mindset related ones do. And that, since neither of them is specifically on mic today, you're not going to get to hear about, unfortunately. But just watch, because there's always something to pick up from a mirror match, even if you don't play the character that the mirror match is about.
Round one. Fight!
Looks like you could use more training.
Round two. Fight! Alex wins. Round one. Fight!
I'm all warmed up. I'm all warmed up. I'm all warmed up. Right here.
But even as I say that there's always something to learn from the mirror match, y'all young whippersnappers in your mirror matches, I remember back in the day when you couldn't both select the same character.
Looks like I won. All right.
Round two. Fight!
I'm all warmed up. I'm all warmed up. Yeah. Right here.
Alex wins. Let's do this.
Okay, let's rumble.
This match usually turns out to be interesting and shows some disparities, mainly because of the general way that Cosby Wolf normally plays Nikali, but I believe there's a different idea in mind for how to play Nikali today. There's going to be a lot of blocking and waiting for a specific advantage in spacing that comes about naturally as the interaction between these two characters goes through. It's really useful for Nikali players, in fact, because it means they sort of win this match on rhythm. Alex has to do more things that he wouldn't otherwise have to do because his block strings leave him at spacing so advantage to Nikali. Usually it just means you use slightly different buttons, but that's not enough by itself. Fortunately, he was ready for that, and the DDT helps quite a lot here too. Ooh, that was a drop though. That was blatantly a drop. Still, enough to get through. This means that the match isn't necessarily particularly intense for either player. In order for Alex to keep on attacking long enough to have a block string, he can't use many specials. Once he does finish his block string, he probably couldn't grab anywhere in it, and Nikali is at a position that is advantage to Nikali. Alex has no invincible moves to disrespect Nikali's check or go through it, meaning that Nikali doesn't really have to do a whole lot of work. There's not a lot of buttons that need to be used specifically, not a lot of meter need to be used specifically. One of the most important things actually is deciding when Alex doesn't have that option or has gone for something entirely different, and that it's time to reversal him away.
Alex wins.
This is the same reason why Alex has problems with Akuma. Akuma is also similar to Nikali in where Akuma gets advantage at the end of block strings. But for Alex to break through this, or even to play certain forms of neutral, he becomes susceptible to the light kick, and Akuma and Nikali have very similar light kick setups. It does take some patience to get to the point of the match where the light kick is the correct thing to do, because, I mean, if Alex just keeps on hitting buttons, then obviously the light kick is not usually the correct thing to do. But it can be good sometimes to hit it a little bit to get Alex to try to go for the block strings, because depending on your situation, Nikali may be able to convert into really big damage from the same sort of situation. And being able to just use the meter to become plus at that point means that if Nikali does decide to press a button and push Alex out, there's always something to keep the pressure up on that side. Alex benefits a lot therefore from using, interestingly, the reversal in a lot of spacings and situations as an offensive tool to push Nikali to the corner faster. Once this is done, the push back situation stops being a problem, and you can do what you like. Ooh, that was a good job.
Alex wins.
So, given that Just Fine's connection looked like it might be bad, we might be able to do something about it, but we're not necessarily sure she's going to get a game in now. Let's see what it looks like. Maybe she isn't one bar to other people. She's definitely one bar to this side, which implies things might not go well. Alright, we'll see what happens. The bars do not always mean that things will not work out, but The other useful thing is that the last time it's been unstable enough, it wasn't laggy, it just cut out immediately, which, while bad, is not as likely to lead to a terrible experience for players, just a jarring one. This does mean, though, that we are back to looking at something akin to the defensive style of play. In this case, though, because Alex has enough range and Jury doesn't automatically win in footsies anymore, she uses her specials a lot more, as whiff punishes primarily, but because they both make her at least somewhat vulnerable, she has to rely on something else. She specifically has to rely on the heavy Fuharin and on forward jump light kick when close up and something didn't go quite right. You can see that the choice of V skill 2 is obviously greater option-wise here for the same reasons. You're just looking for that spot where, okay, I know you're just outside my range. You want to hit buttons, I need to whiff punish those buttons. But when you're otherwise in neutral and have no control of the situation, your better option is to have something to make Alex not do Alex things. And honestly, Jury's V skill 2 is one of the best ways in the game to prevent Alex from just doing Alex things. It changes all of his flows, even if it doesn't necessarily get to do damage. The problem is finding the space for it.
Round 2. Fight.
Their flow doesn't imply to me that this is particularly laggy. So we're gonna hope that everything's fine one way or the other. This is one of the better options, but because Jury is so specifically able to get out of Alex's tick throw setups compared to most characters, it doesn't tend to last too long. One only gets a certain amount of damage payoff out of it because even EX Powerbomb doesn't lead into much for Alex, unfortunately. He's not a pure grappler, wasn't allowed to be one, and therefore doesn't get to do that. Oof. Another unhelpful point from Alex's side is actually that Jury moves under a lot of his jumps at the spacings you would otherwise want it to work out. Is that going to be the disconnection point? Because now it has to send a whole bunch of data to a server, and now it's going to be like, oh, well, I can't reach the server, so clearly I should not be doing this and things. Alright, we'll see. There we go. At least the spectating has been halted. We'll see what happens. But we still got to see a reasonably good match, and talk a little bit about it. Hopefully it was not laggy particularly for either side. Oh, apparently it is still ongoing, it's just that we can't see it. So, we might get a little more to say yet. Similar to how one generally should bait Seth, therefore, Jury generally should just forward jump light kick out of nearly everything Alex does at close range. This is not to say that you won't take some damage for doing this, but as a character, Alex going from, let's say, heavy punch into medium punch and then a combo from the medium punch is nowhere near as much damage as getting hit with EX Powerbomb and pushed into a position you don't want to be in. A lot of this, as noted, is avoiding damage, and it's one of the easier ways to avoid damage. Grapplers do tend to suffer somewhat in the long term of fighting games, because there is almost always a way to prevent yourself from being thrown, period, like some way to entirely dodge it, and when there is one, it's usually not that hard to execute compared to most things. In the case of characters like Alex and Abigail, hold up or hold up forward are things most of us can physically do. It's the mental state required to actually get ourselves to do it that's difficult. After all the rest of the time we spend in defense, it's about blocking, not moving, not putting ourselves at risk of being swatted out of the air. And most importantly, not doing something that changes our position very heavily and makes us unable to counterattack. That being one of the biggest key factors in doing a move whose only purpose is to poke at your opponent on the way out of the way of their move. You don't get to do any damage. And eventually, your opponent has no reason to not keep doing the thing because they're not taking any real damage from doing it even if you escape. The reason this is still important though is because if you were winning in neutral, if you were able to dominate that part of the matchup, and jumping out gets you back to neutral, your opponent is still stressed. They will probably still do the same sort of thing once they get in close, but they weren't necessarily getting in close that easily. So countering it fairly early is helpful. And at least making them think about it, rather than them getting in being an immediate thought of, okay, I'm being rewarded, time for some big damage. They now have to think about the fact that you got away and possibly got back to neutral again. Well, we didn't get to see how that went, but it doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot. We are back to looking at another offense versus defense match though, since the President Seth tends to play defense even against Alex. I say even against as if this was really surprising, but it's actually somewhat so because Alex is one of the few characters who Seth's V skill work really well on. We've talked about this and touched on this in previous streams. Normally, Seth using Tandon Engine doesn't lead to much because it's just an extender of combos. It does not provide any move that the player has never seen before, or any move that they can't just normally do. For Alex and to some extent M. Bison, the move that is offered is a move that generally requires a charge. So to get the option to just do Alex's Stomp or Bison's Scissor Kick while just walking in neutral if you want to, gives Seth an entirely separate tool and an entirely separate approach method that doesn't have to be used in a combo situation. And Seth has more than enough moves to extend combos with and do other things with. The main part here is then, can I whiff punish with my V skill well enough to get the data? Literally. A proper whiff punish with Seth's V skill against Alex leads to now having a move that can be used in the same offensive situation as the V skill, so positioning doesn't have to change, is even more stressful, can be comboed out of things that really should not have a jumping move comboed out of. And the entire style of play leads to Seth having V trigger earlier. So Alex can't exactly just stick out buttons. Worse yet, at the optimum range for using this method, Alex doesn't get a benefit from doing it either. Even at suboptimal ranges, the Alex player shouldn't really be sure that they can just go for stuff because Seth has like instant jump, slash kick options, and a whole bunch of stuff. This is more complex than most matchups, similar to the Cody Jury one. But it does have a understandable core for the most part. What might be difficult to understand watching it is what the players are thinking at the time. For example, that moment of thinking to go for pressure wasn't necessarily a bad idea, but what made All Might do the super on wake up? Who knows? It was a good decision, obviously, but there's another super on wake up, but not one that actually succeeds because Alex is apparently a badass.
Alex wins.
But as you can see, compared to our other matches with Seth so far for the night, and to some extent with Alex so far, this is a lot more closely fought, both in terms of the outcomes and the positions and the concepts that the both players are employing. Alex also stands so far away that other options beyond Seth's actual just using the V skill don't always work as well on the confirm. Add to that Alex's armored moves and you have a recipe for, yeah, I'm just gonna V skill you because it's easier. Even more so helped by the fact that, honestly, you don't really need the V trigger to win this matchup, meaning you could V reversal your way out of a ton of problems. Alex therefore is constantly pushing through all of Seth's options. Whenever Seth blocks, Alex is basically safe. When Seth chooses to go for something else and manages to succeed, it can cause Alex big problems. And it's not as if there aren't other options to whiff punish, so you don't always have to be thinking, oh well, I'm gonna have to worry about being caught if I go for this V skill all the time. In fact, the president has not really needed to do so far. But there it is now, and this is probably the most dangerous timing for it to happen. Full meter, now less so, but... But the tick throw!
Alex wins.
And as for all of you My Hero Academia fans, sometimes you gotta punch them 300 times.
It's go time.
This matchup is interestingly one where Alex often plays defense. And since Kansuki Dynasty for the most part does have at least some automatic responses to certain of Alex's other options, it forces that aspect of the match even further. Therefore, we're still going to have to think about, well, is this going to be a matter of Kansuki Dynasty going in too hard / thinking she has to land a hit? So we're basically just going to watch this one, because there's too much going on in this match normally, especially with the changes to V skill and V trigger we're seeing All Might employ now.
Round one.
But hopefully that won't be her downfall today.
Round two. Fight.
I'm ready.
You lose.
Fighting games cannot be a long road of self-reflection, but our goal remains the same.
Fight.
Either through bots or through the little bits of analysis, make you at least able to know why you're losing. That way you can decide on any given day whether or not you need to practice X or Y thing, whether or not you think you can handle even playing that day, and even down to which games you prefer to play as a generality. Spoiler, we are kinda judgmental about which games are good versus not, as most players are. But that just means you probably shouldn't engage us on the matter. Even if we don't like your game, or rather the game we like the best, we might still have at least something to say about it. Although probably not, because if we don't like it that much, we probably don't know enough to say, and only know how to make bots off of what other high-level players of the game tell us. Since many of our goals don't even involve making high-level bots, that tends to be a lot more, hey, how can I get any high-level concept at all into what this bot is already doing? While still maintaining all of the really crazy lower-level stuff that most characters are capable of doing. Even in Street Fighter, you still have to deal with that quite a lot. It's one of those games that doesn't quickly become unrecognizable. That is definitely a thing that a couple of games, not saying anything negative about those ones at all, no sarcasm whatsoever, some games become unrecognizable at high levels relative to lower level players, and it happens relatively quickly. Because you have to get past one little goal and then the entire game changes suddenly. And then sometimes another small one and another massive change to the game. Street Fighter is generally not this. Or rather, the ways in which you see this happen
Round 1.
are inherent to the game up until that point. You just didn't necessarily notice they were happening. It's not, I learned to do this thing, therefore. Those do happen in Street Fighter, definitely. If you are starting out with a fighting game, particularly this one, anti-airing is usually that in itself for probably like a month. Can you anti-air or not is the changing process for the game, but that still generally counts as early enough, especially the way most players play, that it still matters. And even at the highest levels, being ready to anti-air every time can still be a challenge, so it's not as if jumping becomes basically useless. On the other end of the spectrum from this, actually, we have Kohime, which is a game where you should generally at low levels never jump. You're going to get anti-aired. Just going to. The jumps are so telegraphed, the buttons are so generally not advantageous, and the opposing anti-airs are so good most of the time that if you jump, you're going to get hit. But that only happens because you haven't learned to play footsies yet.
Final round. Fight.
Because only at the nearly highest levels of Kohime do you get to jump. Or rather, jump with strong intent and the expectation that you probably won't get anti-aired. This is a whole strategy. I'm specifically jumping now because this is a good idea. Rather than, let's hope that nothing bad happens. Ducks the DDT, and the EX Mujin.
You win.
And I believe that brings Kansuki Dynasty to the victor position for the lounge at the moment. We're fairly full right now, which also means that if you come in now, it will take a little while for you to get your matches, unless someone else leaves because of that same reason. But All Might probably is due for a break, relatively, having beaten nearly everyone repeatedly. And that brings us to one of our most important matchups for personal growth on both sides. Kansuki Dynasty and Sundir often face off, and going up in level is a thing you constantly see between the two of them. Every time, basically every lounge where they face off for any reasonable length of time, I have to say something different because they've gotten past the last things. Unfortunately, it has happened to pick the worst possible stage, so I guess Suntir will probably be playing without sound this time. So bearing that handicap in mind, either that the sound will be totally too distracting, or wait, maybe not.
Round one. Fight.
Oh good! We're in luck. The stage music was not the one that ended up being played on this side. I don't know what happened on that side, because the game apparently doesn't play the same music for both players. Rude. But this is going to be a lot of maneuvering. It's always a lot of maneuvering. And because Kansuki Dynasty in particular doesn't have the same fear reaction that many of Suntier's other opponents tend to have, and is, if anything, more aggressive about it, it's harder to push back on certain things that she does. This doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be perfect punishes on those things for Suntier to have a good enough advantage, but rather that a certain level of twitchiness is always to be expected, and it's always going to cause a certain type of problem. Karine is almost always better positioned to keep hitting buttons than Akuma is. Technically, this means that Akuma should usually either jump or backdash, but the neutral jump against Karine does not work as well for this character in particular. The reason being more so because Akuma has trouble confirming certain combos from the range that Karine tends to get hit at than other characters. And unfortunately, most of the time, if the
You win.
V-trigger is active, the air fireball does not necessarily help, because Kansuki Dynasty can in fact react to it quickly enough to go under it, or to trade with an air-to-air style jump, even on that one. Meaning that unless one has the life lead, it's not going to help. The back jump does have better outcomes most of the time, but you're still going to have the same overall problem in neutral. There's no way to get advantage out of any of Akuma's tools too strongly. You have to basically have to rely on offense and his damage output a lot more. There's a good demonstration of that. Max range sweep doesn't really have a good punish from Akuma's side. There's some stuff you got, but it's not optimal. Fireball timing helps though.
Round two. Fight.
A lot of this therefore comes down to the aspect of this game that Suntier spends approximately the least time practicing. Really explosive damage. That is always going to be one of the hardest parts of this matchup. But as you can see, 2 meters is quite a chunk of Karine's health in nearly every way you do it, honestly. So proper use of meter helps a lot, and therefore proper tracking of the meter helps more. Fortunately, there's usually lots of time for Akuma to do that in this matchup. That is in fact one of the most important things. We were talking about it before as a good way to pause just the right amount of time. That helps Akuma a lot more in this matchup than most. Just realizing, okay, how much meter do I have? And that moment being enough of a pause to give Karine the wrong impression while staying in a defensive enough stance. This helps even more once you've trained yourself to either respond to or correctly block Resenha, because it means that the problem of the standard Karine player going for a Resenha because you're not doing anything goes away. There was probably no way out of that.
You win.
One of the largest problems of not quite having the life lead and needing to do a pressure strike. Your opponent will probably super, and even if you baited it, you're probably still going to die. It depends on the character, of course, but it's definitely a tactic that you really don't get much choice in the matter of. If you are in that situation, your chance of losing has already been pushed rather high.
Let's do this.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight. Final round. Fight. You lose. Round one. Fight.
With Punch of the Capcom Pro Tour and a lot of other things shifted to online tournaments, even exhibition-y ones, there is an aspect of all of this offense and defense work that ties directly into that. Most of us definitely don't feel super comfortable just entering tournaments. You don't tend to see players who are in the lower ranks of the game in tournament play unless you know they're the sort of person who has a second account and doesn't actually level up at all, or thinks that they're extremely good but never actually plays ranked, which could be true or not true, but you don't generally have a way to know too strongly, because even if you're really good in lounges, it might mean that you're better at beating strong players and not necessarily weaker players. That's a whole thing. If you want to know all that's all about, ask Ultra David. But one thing this does give you, if you are clear enough in both your understanding of your offense and defense and where you tend to fail, all you do is add some practice and one more part to your mindset. If you think to yourself, I never win, I can't rank up because I never anti-air, but you occasionally have those matches where you do anti-air, everything works fine, you just work perfectly, you didn't get frustrated, you landed everything you needed to land. You are what we will generally call tournament ready. Not necessarily because you have any chance of winning this tournament, but because you can define exactly why you wouldn't. If your offense and understanding are good, if your concept of how the game should be played are at least reasonable, if your defense stands up to the bulk of things that people throw at you under most circumstances and you don't flinch too much, and your reasoning for trouble in your matches is, oh, I keep on failing my anti-air, I keep on failing my meaties, I keep on failing my wake up, but I can do them some of the time. There's not much harm for you to enter the tournament or to go to the casuals if it's, you know, when this pandemic is over and we actually get to do this, because there's always that day where you just hit all the anti-airs. There's always that day where you land all the meaties. Judging yourself over whether or not you drop things isn't particularly healthy, because those things are things you practice, and if you practice enough, even if you don't get to 100%, you'll know that this is probably the reason you're going to lose. You're going to probably be calmer about it as well. Generally, your aim should not be to reach tournament level directly, but incidentally via realizing how the game works for you. If you can do almost all of the things mentally, but occasionally drop the combo, then you're probably as close to tournament ready as most people with a limited amount of practice time are going to get.
Round one. Fight.
When you haven't practiced enough at all, when you can say with certainty, I can't anti-air, there's no way I'm going to get through a full tournament match and not get jumped on for massive damage. That is going to happen at some point. Then you probably need to practice more because you're not ready. But if you do occasionally have those matches where you just anti-air every time, and more so spend your time wondering, why am I not anti-airing today? I was anti-airing fine a couple days ago. I was reading all my opponent's movements properly a couple days ago. And you're not faced with the feeling of, I don't know what's going on, I'm helpless, I don't have an idea of how to play offense here, I don't know how to play defense here. Those things. Without those feelings, you might as well go to most tournaments. Because the thing that is going to bring you down is your hands, your fingers, your controller. And online, obviously, lag. But it's not going to be necessarily, I didn't know what to do here. And if it is, you probably learned something. One wonderful part for many players of the fact that many more tournaments are likely to be online is that they don't have to have a friend to record their matches or need to get on stream before they can go back and look at things. In fact, online tournaments help even more in that the frame data and everything is completely available to you. You can just literally watch your replay in slow motion if you want and see exactly how plus your opponent was, exactly how much of a setup a certain thing was, whether or not you were being misled by a specific hitbox or hurtbox, exactly how much meter they had at that moment where you thought they didn't have meter yet. And this allows you to reference all of the times where you really did make something that was a wrong decision and didn't just drop a combo. And when you've gotten to, oh, there's my mistake, then you can work on it. But of course our hope is that you are able to play against bots to buff out so much of that before you get into any matches that your opponent must be able to actually mislead you or strain you in order to take a victory. This can happen at any level, this can happen at any rank, but at least that is the thing that has to happen.
Round one. Fight!
Get right there!
Let's do this! Round one. Fight!
Looks like you could use more training.
Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! Seth wins. Round one. Fight!
Ooh, that was well executed, but that means this is a rough push for Alex again. Seth benefits a lot more than most characters from getting Alex to the corner, mainly because of Seth's ability to use unconventional attacks that don't necessarily lead to being on the ground, and more importantly, don't actually put Seth on the other side of Alex. Many characters can benefit from the similar tactics by attempting to jump over his head, and a couple have these dive kick style things, or quick overhead fuzzy guard style things that lead to good damage, but if Alex does get out, they tend to end up on the other side and end up cornered themselves. Not the best thing to go for. That said though, Seth is not one of those characters. There's always an option at least in there, whether it be setting up for a scramble to use an invincible move, or straight up attacking from the air, in ways that Alex has very few straight counters for if going for other things. And that was a similar setup to before, except that, you know, now with the actual V trigger active, no way to V reversal out, and no timing at which the parry would save. Here's a match I have less to say about because I normally say the exact same thing every time and it doesn't really need to be repeated. This is all about how much Seth flinches trying to play neutral with Akuma, because every flinch will lead to getting Tatsu'd. Every moment of retreat leads to being unsure of what to do against Tatsu, or Akuma not needing to use the Tatsu. The rest of the flow is quite heavily based on projectile usage, and in some cases the spacing of the tandem engine. Since Akuma's parry doesn't really help against tandem engine, it's a better option against a lot of things, but it's still susceptible enough to the Tatsu. In the end, counting on the fact that Akuma has low health, the Tatsu will eventually go wrong, Seth has big damage, is probably the better way to do this, but at the end of it, you're still playing Akuma's game, more so. Fortunately for Seth, most players will bait the uppercut, which is the correct thing to do, and therefore it's easier to get away from pressure situations after a knockdown. Mainly because the other player will go, well, I probably shouldn't do anything, and therefore the presence of mind enough to not go for pressure helps out. Playing aggressively from Seth's side is too easily countered by Akuma though, because Seth is not one of those characters that gets a lot of V-reversal setup kick throw style things, meaning that Akuma can just V-reversal out of basically all of it. It helps if you don't do so too early, and you do have to spend some time at least watching what options Seth is going for, but because Seth has less really threatening close range options for that, it's usually just, okay, I'm going to V-reversal now. It's actually a fairly heavy judgment call when Akuma is low on health, whether to use the V-trigger or not, because you end up in this situation. There's no more resources to do much with, and unless... yeah, there we go. But unfortunately, that spacing also comes up to be a problem sometimes.
Round 2. Fight.
This usually leaves Seth at meter advantage, which is a problem, but not a terribly large one, as the main thing Seth uses meter for in this matchup are the exact same things Akuma wants to bait most of the time. And of course, the super. So, a lot of this is going to come down to, interestingly, defense from Suntier's side. V-reversals, timings of uppercuts, jump outs, and sometimes probably even teleports, because Seth is not the character that normally goes straight for throw on wake up. I think Seth's dash does catch up with Akuma though, so it is possible that it will still be countered, but you know, not if you probably decided to go for something else first.
Fight.
The other option is just never get knocked down and the problem will never come up.
Round 2. Fight. Final round. Fight. Seth wins. It's go time. Let's do this. Round one. Fight!
As I've doubtless mentioned many times, this match is one of the ones that is more likely to come down to issues of mental fortitude and preparedness. Basically, the one who flinches first usually loses. But as both players increase in their skill in the matchup, footsies appears more and more, meaning that there's slightly less of that happening at any given time, even though neither character is directly likely to hit the other that much. Seth gets hit with Kareen's sweep slightly less, Kareen gets hit by Seth's forward medium punch, I believe it is, slightly less. And there's a lot more thinking in neutral about which specific character can be baited rather than just who has the better buttons at X range.
Round one. Fight!
that said, it's also a fairly good match to end our stream on. I don't expect the lounge to be ending anytime soon. In fact, I expect more people to be joining it. So if you want to get your games against anyone here, try to get in fairly soon, especially if you were like not really wanting to be on stream. Because we've definitely had a couple situations like that where people showed up at the end after the stream so that they could get certain types of practice.
Round 2. Fight.
That makes this our last on-stream set of the night, but definitely not one where we're expecting a close of the lounge. It may go on for at least another hour, if not more than that. We'll reach 10 Eastern, because there's a lot of practicing to do of a particular type. So you can continue to look for 3 rounds first to 2 with character select off, looking for Rune Siren if you want to join it. You can find all of our bots on our website 2-mk.org, and potentially erroneous due to weird stuff with internet tweets telling you our plans for the night, usually around 7 Eastern or a little before that, at our Twitter 2_MK_FGC. Team members in general are hard to get into contact with if you need them for something. But you can try either the Twitter or the contact page on 2-mk.org if you need anything related to the bots or just need to get into contact with one of us for some reason. Remember everyone, coming back from nearly a perfect is just a perfect in reverse.
You win.
And a good way to make my closeout timing entirely incorrect.
Round 1. Fight.
But you can enjoy Hansuki Dynasty's third match in relative silence from me because she earned it, so assume that the stream will end at the end of this match. And once again, join us if you want to. Tomorrow, we're definitely strongly considering, much more strongly than usual, considering having our under night lounge Tuesday train. And Wednesday might see some content too, but usually it's not both. So check the Twitter and don't think too hard that it's going to happen. What you can expect is our Dead or Alive 6 content on Thursday. And Fridays have been rough, so I'm not expecting any Friday content either, which means that for Street Fighter you can join us again next week for another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge. With this holiday weekend coming up, things may shift, but most likely this will not be the thing that does. People quite like this lounge, and are usually prepared for it after a weekend of either training or getting to relax enough. So depending on your game of interest, we'll see you then. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night everyone.